Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Mark Andrew Holacek, Thomas Jefferson Scholar, and today I come to you this Thursday afternoon to do the first episode of a show I'd like to call the Real Thomas Jefferson, and we'll focus on Jeffersonian historiography for now. Doesn't get any better than that, huh? Keith Moon on drums, the Ox on bass, John Entwistle on guitar, and Roger Daltrey doing the vocals. Really good stuff. So this is the show I call the real Thomas Jefferson, hence the introduction through the Who from Quadrophenia. Um, what's the motivation for this show? I moved to Lynchburg 5 years ago on account of hoping to make some inroad to the narrative at Poplar Forest, which seemed to be following the narrative at Monticello, which is that Jefferson was a hypocrite, racist, bigot, and you know how the story goes. I don't have to inform you on that. And I was typically incensed by the whole notion in 2018 that Thomas Jefferson definitely fathered all of Sally Hemings' children. Even though there's no evidence for that claim. It was an extraordinarily loud and unfounded claim, ungrounded claim, and yet they made it nonetheless, even though the only evidence we have for any sort of relationship was a little bit of DNA evidence on Madison Hemings, which showed that Madison may have been fathered by Thomas Jefferson. In other words, the Y chromosome was a Jefferson Y chromosome, which means Jefferson could have been the father, Jefferson's brother could have been a father, Jefferson's brother's sons could have been the father, and so on. We have a long list of candidates. What incensed me, someone whose training is typically and generally in philosophy, I taught philosophy for 33 years, is the eschewal of truth in the pursuit of history today, especially vis-a-vis the founding fathers. And since I've taken up Thomas Jefferson, as you probably know, I've authored 25 books on Thomas Jefferson, and yet I have been blacklisted by the larger Jefferson community, by the people at Monticello, by the people at Poplar Forest, even by the Wikipedia community, the Thomas Jefferson Studies Center, and back of so forth, and the general climate at UVA, which is so anti-Thomas Jefferson, thanks to the last Thomas Jefferson Foundation scholar, Pete Pedionoff, who did everything he could to blacken and tarnish the reputation of the great Thomas Jefferson. So I want to talk to you today in the first episode of The Real Thomas Jefferson on the historiography that takes us where we're at with the tarnished relationship of Jefferson, namely the historical revisionism, the progressivism, the postmodernism, the presentism, and the wokeism. And I'm going to treat all these as one, even though they don't deserve to be treated as one. They don't. They're not all mutually entailing, as it were. I.e., presentism is just the tendency to use present conceptions to understand, with respect to understanding the past, which I think is a great crime of historiography. I want to begin by the sort of by the conception that truth matters. Now, I ask you to imagine a world, four different worlds: one in which no one ever speaks the truth, one in which people sometimes speak the truth, another in which people most often speak the truth, but not always, and a fourth in which people always speak the truth. Now, the first and second worlds, people never speaking the truth or seldom speaking the truth, obviously wouldn't work. There couldn't be any kind of sense of community because in our exchanges, our social exchanges with other people, truthfulness is tremendously important. If we spoke not the truth all the time or most of the time, we'd never be able to communicate. If I stopped in for gas and someone's ready to pump my gas and asks, well, how many gallons you want? I said 14. What's the person going to think? Well, does he really want 10? Does he want 20? Does he want 30? Uh, Obviously, I don't need to expound on that. The world in which everybody spoke the truth all the time is the sort of Kantian idealistic world. Kant thought, because of great regard for human rationality and human dignity, that all human beings ought to treat other human beings with fullest respect. And part of that recipe for treating people with fullest dignity meant that you are truthful in all your relationships. Now, is that humanly possible? I think it's not, but so I'll put that on the side for now. But anyways, suffice it to say that the world in which people speak truthfully most of the time to most people is the world in which we live in. Okay, truth is a tremendously important aspect of human communication. Um, and I want to say it ought to be the driving force of all historians, right? Now, according to the revisionists today, revisionism is just the view that past historians exaggerated about take American figures. We tended to look only at the virtues and avoid their vices and so forth. So the idea is we need to focus on the small history, looking at the slaves and the other neglected people, females, and the average person and so forth. And we need to put in abeyance, as it were, the people who are writing the large history and making heroes of everybody, and basically revise the whole thing, offer an alternative to it, right? And the dangerous thing here is that the alternative always deals with a lot of bashing of these figures and wholesale destruction of their accounts, even though there's so much worth salvaging in these great early accounts. Now, postmodernism came about as a challenge, decades ago, that said, okay, first off, you had the pre-modern era, then you have the modernist era, then you have the postmodern era. And without getting into the pre-modern era, the modern era seems to be the era in which, with respect to history, um, the modernists practice history according to facts from the ground up, practice it analytically, practice it critically, rigorously, and comprehensively. And the idea here, following the great Leopold von Ranke, is that wie es eigentlich gewesen ist. We need to practice history as it actually happened. Now the postmodernist, is up in arms at that this is really a prescription for failure. What does it mean to see history as it actually happened? And there's a sense in which the postmodernist is right to be highly critical of this. I'm going to tie all this into how we do Jefferson today at the end. But what does it mean for something as it actually happened? Is there any as it actually happened? What does that mean? I think it's a rather empty phrase, so I'm sort of sympathetic with the postmodernists as regards that. Because there's so many different perspectives, right? When one looks, if I'm a carpenter, for example, and if I'm looking at, or if I'm like Jack McLaughlin, who writes a biography of Thomas Jefferson, the builder, if I'm someone who has expertise in building, I might be interested in Thomas Jefferson, the builder. So I have my own different perspective, and I focus on that. Or if I'm a moralist, like I am, I wrote my book, Thomas Jefferson Moralist, I might focus on Thomas Jefferson, the moralist, and so forth. Someone else might focus on Thomas Jefferson, the architect, Thomas Jefferson, the gardener. And all these perspectives are legitimate perspectives because Thomas Jefferson was legitimately all these people at the same time. So these perspectives are not necessarily contradictory, but they offer us a different way of looking at Thomas Jefferson. And each of these different ways are good ways. Okay. Now, the postmodernist would argue, does argue, I should say, forget the subjunctive, is that history, historiography is the history of history, as all people seem to agree, even though it's a sort of circular and unavailing definition. But there's yesterday's history, there's today's history, there's tomorrow's history, and there need not be anything that ties all these things together, need not be any thread between the three. In the words of Carl Becker, the progressivist historian, argued that every man is his own historian, title of a very famous paper he gave, and never understood the thread of that argument because, in effect, um, all of history he writes is fiction. We can't access the past, so what one person writes is his own account, and second person writes another account, a third account. And according to Becker's argument, is that we don't even need professional historians. It's silly to think of someone being a professional historian because each person has his own slant, right? He writes, every generation, our own included, must inevitably understand the past and anticipate the future in light of its own restricted experience, must inevitably play on the dead whatever tricks it finds necessary for its own peace of mind. So, in some sense, historians are sort of trying to placate themselves, to satisfy themselves in terms of what they're doing. So, what they do is each historian writes up his own account of the way things happened and so forth. And as it were, because we can never know how things actually happen, we wind up playing tricks on the dead for our own peace of mind. Now, there are different arguments for the postmodernist progressivist, right? Um, Whatever you want to say, the wokist, the revisionist, and so forth. One of which is the main argument is roughly the inaccessibility of the past. That is, my friend Ari Heller writes, history is about the past. The past is not directly, because it is the past, it's not directly accessible as is the present, for example. So we cannot have, if we cannot have direct access to the past, we cannot know what we're doing when we're writing about the past, right? Um, that argument, it seems to me, just doesn't fly because there are all sorts of pieces of evidence we get about the past, primary source materials, archaeological evidence, DNA evidence, that help us sort of reconstruct what happened in the past. So remoteness is a difficulty, certainly, but it's not an insurmountable difficulty. Second argument, the argument from present biases. Today we have certain biases, things that concern us in our culture, our society today, and these biases invariably come into play when we write about the past. I can talk about, for example, the focus on racism today in American history, the fact that we are preoccupied with our own racial tensions, and what we do is we project them onto past figures for some strange reason. We use the word placate ourselves again by, for example, as Counter Cruiser Bryan said, is that Thomas Jefferson may have been the first figure in the KKK, right? Right. He may have been the first person really to move that along. So we sort of explain away present problems without putting too much blame on ourselves by putting blame squarely on the shoulders of past figures. Thirdly, there's the argument from personal biases that each person has his own biases. Um, each person has a unique biology. Each person has a unique history in terms of cultural exposure to this and that. And my biology and cultural exposure make me who I am over time. And my interests, lack of interest, go into how I write history. For example, someone might argue that Holacek's interest in Thomas Jefferson is due to, you know, maybe certain similarities. He had a similar curiosity about things, so he finds Jefferson an attractive figure, right? And as people are wont to dub me to say that I'm an apologist for Jefferson, I think nothing can be more silly. I don't think apologism isn't a way to approach anything, especially history. Avoidance of that is completely important. So the postmodernist argues that modernism is passe. This whole notion of doing history analytically, critically, following the facts, right, and building upon, criticizing other people, building upon, and working towards a veridical account of what actually happened is not viable. Um, now, I'm going to focus on three particular problems with postmodernism. One of which is the notion of historiography being a valid discipline. If we talk about historiography being the history of history, which is circularly unavailing, the fact that we can break history into three parts, pre-modern, modern, and postmodern, assumes that each of those things has there's a thread to each. We call each uh, epochs of history because there is something in common between all three, right? Otherwise, we wouldn't call them history. And I think that's a legitimate complaint against the postmodernist. The problem with the postmodernist is the postmodernist sees the pre-modern history as a sort of infantile, underdeveloped point. The modernist as a overly sanguine, overly optimistic period of history, um, when people thought there could be a science of history, and they were shown by the postmodernist phase that there can be no science, given the arguments that I just gave you, from personal biases, present biases, and the inaccessibility of the past. Those arguments don't work, by the way, but that's the whole basis of this. The whole notion is if there is an essence to historiography, if there is a science of the history of history, and the postmodernists seem to agree to this, that there's something to the pre-modern, modern, and postmodern. All these things have some one thing in common at least, so we can all call them epochs of history. Then there is a sort of science of history. They have something in common. And that's not what the postmodernist wants. The postmodernist wants something radically different, wants to delegitimize the prior to the pre-modern and the modern phases and only legitimize the postmodern phase when anything goes. And that takes us to a second objection, the notion of pre-modern, modern, and postmodern phases, right? If we understand that the pre-modern is underdeveloped, the modern was overly optimistic and failed on all of its promises because we can't know anything about the past. And then in the postmodernist period, we have a sort of enlightenment. The light bulb goes off, and we realize we can't do history. Um, that every person's as good as any other person when it comes to history, and that there really is no way to do history. There's no such thing as a professional historian and so forth. So we write whatever we feel like writing, and all things are good. I guess the only desideratum would be consistency, that we don't throw in gobs of contradictions. Though according to the postmodernist, I don't know why consistency should be a desideratum, why logic should matter, because they seem to obviate the rules of logic at every step of the way. Okay, now the problem with these three phases is it presupposes a development over time. Development, and the postmodernist thinks that postmodernism is an advance over modernism, which is a step beyond pre-modern. If the enlightenment we get in postmodernism is of such a kind that we outrightly reject modernism, then we made a sort of progress. But according to postmodernism, there's no such thing as progress in history. It's all fiction. So how can we argue substantively that postmodernism is an advance over modernism if all history is fiction? The three-phase story of the postmodernist is all, as it were, at the same time historical fiction, right? Because everything is fiction. So the model they give you is fiction, in which case it sort of destroys itself. Everything winds up being suffocatingly subjective, and we wind up getting nowhere You can see, obviously, I love postmodernism and the sort of relativistic subjectivism upon which it is founded. Um, Third objection, of course, we can't actually understand events as they actually happened, right? I don't even know what that means, as I said. Imagine trying to give an account of the Revolutionary War as it actually happened. Well, that's a impossible task. There's going to be a British perspective, an American perspective, and so many different perspectives from the American side. There's the Virginian perspective, maybe of Thomas Jefferson as governor, the New England perspective. It's, the idea is it's such a complicated, um, inexplicably complicated event with the concatenation of all sorts of interrelated events is so horribly complex. No historian can understand all the links that go on there. So the best you do is try to come up with a summary of the most important facets that go into explanation. And there is, according, as the postmodernist urges, an element of arbitrary, I don't want to say subjectivism necessarily, but arbitrariness. We sort of pick out certain things we can't know if things we're picking out are the more salient, for example. All right. I mean, but that does not make the historical enterprise bootless. There's archaeological evidence. There's primary testimony evidence. There's circumstantial evidence, which doesn't always help us as much as we think, like the oral tradition. Now, what are we going to make of oral traditions? Because they're highly unreliable. Um, and so when people talk about, this is based on oral tradition, it needs to be taken massively cum grano salis, the grain of salt. Okay, so what I'm trying to show is so far that the postmodernists, the progressivists, the subjectivist, relativist perspective takes us nowhere. It's treadmill. We are doing a lot of moving and going nowhere. Um, this has come to predominate in Jeffersonian scholarship. This is how people at Monticello get away with the politicizing of Thomas Jefferson's life and his legacy, how he can be called a racist and a bigot and a hypocrite and all these things, right? He owned slaves, so he was a bad person. Well, black people at the time owned slaves, not that many, but certainly not as many as whites, but black people owned slaves, and sometimes there were many white slaves. We never tell that story either, as if that was inconceivable. Um, and anyway, so the problem I've had when I moved here, the problem I have with Jeffersonian scholarship, is that the people at Monticello, Peter Onuf was the largest leader of this movement to politicize Jefferson's legacy, to focus on race as a postmodernist, and he's clearly, I'll explain in future episodes, a postmodernist, to explain things by Jefferson's inherent racism is the way to go for him. And it seems to me that's a very dangerous thing. What we wind up doing, there's no truth, but we're going to focus on the racial aspects of Jefferson. How do we know that that's right? What's going on here, in effect, is we have certain people who disavow veridical history, truthful history, take it upon themselves to politicize history. If there's no truth, what we can do is we can tackle pressing political problems like racism or sexism or violence, or whatever we identify as a problem. Problem with that is that if there's no truth, how do we know what we identify as a problem really is a problem? Why should I work against sexual exploitation, right, if there is no truth to the matter? Why should I work towards any goal A instead of not A, or B instead of not B, if there's no truth to the matter, if there's no evidence saying one is definitely bad, the other good, if it's subjective or arbitrary, then we run into and this is the real problem for me, who are the people that are going to decide for us, right? The Onufs, the Gordon Reeds, the people at Monticello, the Andrew O'Shaughnessy's, who are going to decide for us what is good and what is bad for us. That always happens when we get into these situations where we disavow truth. We're going to take up pressing political issues, but without any way of deciding whether this is a good or bad issue. It becomes a matter of arbitrariness or having a certain panel of experts, whatever that means, to have expertise about truth, decide for us what needs to be tackled and then have them tackle it for us. This is autocracy. This is the sort of blind adherence and obedience to tyrants, to people who will decide for us what is in our what is in our best interest. And this is essentially the program that Jefferson all his life disavowed and aimed to repudiate. Each person, he wanted to educate all of us such that we can decide for ourselves what is in our best interest. We can have government that is responsible to the will of the people instead of to the will of tyrants and kings. But we've gone to a situation today in a scenario where we're back to blind obedience to authority, which in effect is not much different to what's going on today in China and Russia. If we bend to the will of the people, many of whom are at our academic institutions who know better for us what needs to be in the curriculum and are going to teach us things that need to be taught to us, even if there's no truth or falsity, because they know better what's good for us. We're in a very dangerous situation. So I begin this with some historiographical insights on the nature of history today, especially as it relates to historical scholarship on Thomas Jefferson. And I hope to have shown why certain people think they can denigrate Thomas Jefferson and get away with it, why they can take some of the largest early American figures and destroy them. Um, you know, what gives them the historical license, the historiographical license to do that? The question is, though, it's a moral question. What gives them the moral perch from which they can judge people? All things are relative and subjectively so, not objectively relevant. What gives them the authority to judge for us what is right and wrong? That puts us in a dangerous situation. And that's where we're at, it seems to me, politically, with the great emphasis on wokeism today. And I say this not as a leftist or a rightist. I'm not partisan politically in any respects. I'm open to decide issues for myself, not because of a party. So I begin the first episode, on the real Thomas Jefferson. I hope you enjoyed a little bit of music from the great band The Who, and trying to explain the intellectual and historiographical climate of the time that we live in today. And I hope, we can illuminate. I'll be doing much more stuff on this, focusing on particular problems in episodes to come. But I just wanted to set an intellectual base for what we've been trying to do. So if you enjoyed this, please like the page. This is going to be a new series, The Real Thomas Jefferson. I'll be focusing on particular problems, particular people that are creating problems today for understanding Jefferson. I'll be focusing on people at Monticello, at Poplar Forest. I'll be focusing on particular authors like Paul Finkelman and other people who seem to have an axe to grind when it comes to Jefferson, who are not content unless they're trying to bury Thomas Jefferson alive, as it were. Hope you enjoyed this. We'll do it again some other time. TTFN.